Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the Warner Archive Blu-ray release of the 1967 suspense thriller Wait Until Dark, which was directed by Terence Young and stars Audrey Hepburn in one of her best performances. The term Hitchcockian gets thrown about a lot, and unfortunately far too often. It's a term that no longer really has the sort of cachet and weight to it that it really should have. But every once in a while you come across a film that you just can't help but get the feeling of that it has not just the flavor of a Hitchcock suspense sequence, but that it has some of his style, some of his humor, and just part of that particular mixture that is unique to a Hitchcock film. So that's when you should apply the Hitchcockian label. And there are certain directors who I think really understood how to make a suspense sequence and how to make a thriller. And there are certain directors, agonizingly few, who could actually, whether they were trying to or not, actually emulate and develop their own version of a, say, Hitchcockian style. I've talked about this some before on my channel, but in particular, I think two directors who were exceptionally good at this and don't really get the credit for it were Terence Fisher and Terence Young, who, of course, did this frequently and to great effect in his James Bond films, most of all in From Russia with Love. But here in this film, it's in full force, and if any film should ever be described as Hitchcockian or Hitchcock-esque, it is this film, Wait Until Dark, that not only has the flavor and style of a Hitchcock film, but also manages to have a style of its own. It's not simply emulating Hitchcock to emulate Hitchcock, as many others have tried to do. The similarity can also be felt in the film's plot, because it actually feels very similar to another film or story in terms of the setup, and that is, of course, Dial M for Murder, that Hitchcock made into a film in 1954. Dial M for Murder was based on the famous stage play that was a big success, written by Frederick Knott, who also wrote Wait Until Dark. That is where the real similarity comes from, because you have the same writer, and it also revolves around a vulnerable woman who is in a small enclosed apartment and has forces of evil essentially coming after her that it seems impossible for her to surmount. And we're also sort of let into the would-be villainy early on in the story, which only sets up the suspense that will then build to a critical and overwhelming point in the story. So you can recognize there's a sort of obvious similarity in the structure of the two tales, and obviously it makes sense when you realize they were written by the same person and both big successful hit stage plays that are now being turned into films. So this already sort of sets the Hitchcock parallel, because of course Hitchcock turned Dial M for Murder into a classic iconic film. So you're always going to have that parallel, but in Wait Until Dark there's also a greater sense of emotional context. There's a greater emotional connection to our characters, which is something that people have criticized Dial M for Murder about a little bit, that the characters do seem a little bit distant, and actually the most relatable character is Ray Milland's vengeful husband who has set all of the crimes in motion to essentially rid himself of his wife. That and so he's a one of the great classic charming Hitchcock villains, but the problem there is a little bit that, of course, the villain is actually more attractive than the supposed hero of the film, and the audience is actually made to empathize with the villain actually a bit more than the intended victim. So here in Wait Until Dark, you don't quite have that same issue, because you are completely engrossed in the heroine's plight, and this is made even more suspenseful because we are dealing with a blind character. So you have somebody put into an incredibly perilous and dangerous situation that she is unaware of, and out of her depth, but also she is a handicapped character. So that really just increases the tension and suspense to unbearable levels quite early on, because the audience is again sort of let into the villain's scheme, so we can already start to get ahead of the plot and see where things are going. And that, of course, makes you start to grip the arms of your chair or lean forward in your chair, because that suspense factor is already getting to the point where it's going to boil over and it becomes wonderfully unbearable. So, with all the sort of Hitchcock parallels out of the way, the actual plot setup is something that we've seen in a lot of different films and stories. But this is one of the instances that I think has kind of cemented it in people's heads, because the film opens essentially with a case of drug smuggling, and the whole opening sequence is quite interesting because there's really not any dialogue, or the dialogue is at a bare minimum, and it feels rather alien to the rest of the film that pretty much takes place in a single apartment and apartment block area. So in this sort of way, because we see this sequence in other countries and taking place in and out of airports, it has a sort of European feel to it, and there's not really any dialogue. So it does actually have the flavor of a pre-title sequence, and in particular, it has the flavor of the classic James Bond pre-title sequence. So the fact that you have Terence Young directing this film, I think, had something to do with that. And of course, having minimal to no dialogue references bits of From Russia with Love as well. And of course, the Terence Young Bond films heavily featured arrivals and departures at airports and a sort of global feel. So for me, that is probably the most you feel a sort of Bondian tinge in terms of Terence Young directing this film. So the whole opening is sort of like a pre-title sequence where we see a bunch of heroin being bundled into a doll that's then brought into the country, and then, of course, given to somebody to then act as a courier unwittingly, and then our would-be smuggler is disposed of, and we then have the various individuals who are now trying to recover said heroin. And we've seen this again in other films, probably most notably before this point, the one that springs to mind, the menacing pair of psychopathic killers and the incredible Don Siegel noir, The Lineup. And we see them trying to recover drugs from a bunch of different unknowing couriers. But here, the drugs inside the doll are essentially traced to the apartment of the Audrey Hepburn character, because her husband was actually the unwitting courier. And of course, because we have seen the actual drug smuggling operation, we know that this is somewhere on the premises or has been left or dropped off somewhere around here. So then when our trio of disreputables show up, we then know that Hepburn's character of Susie is in for not a pleasant evening. Let's just put it that way. And what's also really interesting is that our villains are really three completely different individuals who have different methodologies and different reasons for being there. We have a sort of established pair or a team played by Richard Crenna and Jack Weston, and they have apparently been in operation for some time, and they are trying to recover the smuggled items themselves, but now they're having to deal with the just absolutely menacing character of Mr. Rote, played unforgettably by Alan Arkin, in what was a very early film role for him, because this is basically shortly thereafter his real breakout in The Russians Are Coming. The Russians Are Coming. And this is a completely different kind of character. And he manages to just exude a palpable sense of menace by using, of course, silence and stillness, and he's always wearing a pair of incredibly dark sunglasses. So, of course, he has the sort of soulless appearance because you could never see his eyes. And this sort of interaction between our three villain characters and their sort of back and forth bickering and jostling for power, even though they're all after the same thing. You see them start to set their plans in action when they realize that the smuggled drugs must be in the vicinity or somewhere hidden in this apartment, and the occupants may or may not know that there are drugs there. So it very much mirrors the sort of setup in terms of Dial M for Murder when we have the Rima Land character getting his sort of patsy, the Anthony Dawson character, the would-be murderer of Grace Kelly in Dial M for Murder. We have that sort of mirrored here. So you can see a lot of parallels, and it may only be after you finish Wait Until Dark that you suddenly realize that there's something that reminds you of something else, and then when you just look at who wrote it, it makes perfect sense. And that is the sort of underlying Hitchcockian feel. So that's why all this stuff is inherent, and it's also fascinating and perfectly engaging for the audience because we're let into the secret and we're let into the villain's plan, so that when they actually do start showing up and start trying to ingratiate themselves into the day-to-day activities of Hepburn's character of Susie, we know that everything they say is a lie, and we can see them try to cover up lies when they're about to be discovered and try to maintain these cover stories that they've given themselves and these sort of characters they're playing, these roles they've created, and then how that interplays and how they're trying to think on the fly when things happen or she starts to ask questions, or when their cover stories start to fall apart, they have to do a 180, and so it starts a game of suspense that never lets up and only continues to grow as the lies and the cover stories and the events have to get more and more and more and more outlandish, to the point where finally things boil over and we get to the incredible climax of the film. Now, I really do have to highlight Hepburn's performance in this film. She was nominated for an Academy Award for this film, and of course had won for Roman Holiday many years before when she was really starting out her Hollywood career. But if there was ever a film or performance that I think Audrey Hepburn should have won an Oscar for, it is this film, because not only is she having to play a woman in peril, but she's also having to play a blind character, and she's having to sell this character and the character's blindness while in the middle of an unbelievably intensive suspense thriller that only mounts in energy and intensity as the suspense just continues to ratchet up and characters become more and more and more energetic and frenzied. So to be able to do that while playing a blind character and having the sensitivity of trying to convey the reality of a blind character and sell the suspense sequences while also constantly maintaining a sense of empathy and emotion and reality to the characterization is just, I mean, it's an absolute masterful performance, and I think especially helped by Terence Young being in the director's chair. Terence Young was extraordinarily good, I think, at directing actresses, regardless of what kind of part it is. If you look at his films, there's always a great lead actress performance in there, or all of the actresses in said films. I think this is something you see in his 3 James Bond films, especially, but I think you see it in pretty much every other film he ever made. So I think he had a real knack for getting actresses to really, land the performance and to also feel comfortable enough to get to that particular emotional state for the required scene. And Hepburn's performance has such a sensitivity throughout it that you can't help but just immediately empathize with their character. And she doesn't, the way the character is written and performed, she doesn't, really make any bones about her blindness. She doesn't use it as a crutch. She gets frustrated frustrated by her blindness, and she was essentially trying. She's been trying to come to terms with her disability, because it wasn't something she was born with. It was the result of an accident, we later find out. And so we see her interact with her apartment and her surroundings, and we see her trying to hold on to her interest in her life. And in doing all this stuff, all these little bits of business, it not only helps the audience to fully empathize with her character and understand exactly who she is, and where she is in the world, and how she's trying to cope with everything, which makes her endearing, but it's also giving us the geography and the layout of the apartment, and all of this stuff is going to come into play throughout the rest of the film, and most especially in the climax, because she knows this space better than anyone, because she's going around and she knows every single nook and cranny by feel. And that, of course, sets up the title, and the title is the real climax of the film. It's a particular plot that I don't want to go into a lot of detail, because for those who have never seen this film before, this is a film you need to go in completely cold. Don't let anyone spoil this film for you. It's a incredible film to return to, but that first time in particular, this is one of the great suspense thrillers. It's just one of the great suspense thrillers, period. It is extraordinarily Hitchcockian, primarily because you have it being based on the Frederick Knott screenplay, who also wrote Dial M for Murder. But you have Terence Young in the director's chair, who proved time and time again that he knew how to really handle a suspense sequence in the manner that Hitchcock would, and also have his own particular way of doing it. So he wasn't just directly copying Hitchcock. And just like in From Russia with Love, the entire film builds to a climactic moment of suspense. So really, that sort of pressure cooker of suspense that has built up over the course of the film, it finally erupts in the climax, in the same way that From Russia with Love builds in intensity and suspense until we get the explosion in the iconic train fight. So here you have something similar, a real complete standout moment, where, of course, you kind of get the feeling that this is going to happen at some point, and the trailers really hyped it up quite well, actually. But the title, Wait Until Dark, finally comes into play in the climax, when the Hepburn character is fully menaced without any pretense. All pretense is now gone. She is menaced by the murderous Rote in her apartment in complete darkness. And it is one of the absolute standout suspense moments in films, really, and in complete darkness. And it does not make any bones about, trying to convey the intensity of the sequence and the struggle that's going on, because you obviously can't see anything, and it would be unintentionally funny to just have black screen, no image whatsoever, and just have sounds and things. If you took it out of context, most people would probably just kind of laugh at it. But it is so perfectly executed, and because the whole film builds to this moment, it's quite excruciating. And we have it even slowly gotten into, because it's not complete darkness at first, and we have the character lighting matches and increasing terror and anxiety. And then, of course, we are then in nothing but complete darkness. And this does go on for an extended period of time. It is unbelievably well executed and well done. And if you ever needed proof that Terence Young was a genius director, just show somebody Wait Until Dark, because this picture is unbelievably well put together, well executed. There's not a wasted shot or wasted frame. There's not a wasted moment. And it still remains one of the most effective suspense thrillers ever made and ever produced, and manages to build to its own particular unique type of climax that's not something you really see in every film. It's not something you see every day, in terms of a film's climax being in complete pitch black darkness. It's also, if that were not enough, it's got one of the all-time great, well, really one of the all-time great jump scares. And of course, if you know the film, that's actually quite literal, but not to spoil the film for anyone who hasn't seen it. But it has an unbelievably effective climactic sequence. But again, what makes this unique, even from that sort of Hitchcockian label, is that it does have a great, deeply nuanced and deeply felt emotional context to our lead character, and even the character of her husband, played by Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who is not in the film very much, but he does convey a deep sense of their relationship and their day-to-day dynamic. But also, it's kind of amusing, all the various stories and things that our villains come up with to get the husband away, to keep Susie isolated in this apartment. And again, because we're in on the gag, it becomes increasingly more and more suspenseful, to the point of you're pretty much yelling at the screen at times, because you're so invested, and you're so wrapped up in the moments you're experiencing. And there's a very definite sense of time being compressed and specific, so that way it furthers the suspense, because this isn't taking place over an extended period of time. It's taking place over a compressed, specific period of time where time is itself a factor. So this is easily one of the best suspense thrillers ever produced. It is an incredible film to return to. It has never dated. It does not lose any of its impact. It is one of the few films that I think truly deserves and earns the Hitchcockian label, but it also manages to have its own style. It is not simply trying to emulate Hitchcock to just emulate Hitchcock, which is, again, a real trap that a lot of other films have fallen into. So it's also just an incredible film in its own right, that is further cemented by the incredible performances, the real sense of palpable menace that Arkin just exudes, and again, the unbelievable emotional weight to Hepburn's performance. And again, this is the film she should have won the Oscar for. I really, truly think that. I mean, it's my favorite performance of hers, and she's just unbelievable in this film. The depths at which her characterization has to go to, and the levels of peril that are so deeply felt that they are just physically palpable when you see this film, and furthered by the unbelievable emotional connection that the audience feels for her character, and the empathy that is generated from her first appearance. I mean, to say that Hepburn's character is endearing in this film is an understatement. Her character in this film is pretty much the definition of endearing, and to then know what is threatening her that she is unaware of, and just develops and ratchets up over the course of the film, becomes unbearable in the levels of suspense felt in the audience. And even when you see the film again, and you know how it turns out, the suspense is not lessened, and then we get to the iconic climax and the complete darkness sequence, and it's just still as palpable and deeply felt as it was the first time. So to talk about the Warner Archive Blu-ray, this was a new scan done specifically for this Blu-ray. I believe it's a 2K scan of a particular source. I'm not exactly sure about what they may have scanned, but I believe it was a 2K scan of perhaps an interpositive. This was an earlier Warner Archive disc, and very much an upgrade over the previous Warner DVD, which did have a few nice extras, but this is definitely a film that you do have to worry about transferring properly, because you do have to properly worry about transferring the blackout sequence, or I should say the dark scene or sequence at the climax of the film. So this is a well done transfer of a really wonderful element. It has nice grain structure, it has nice color, it is leaps and bounds better than the old DVD, which was a pretty solid Warner DVD, but was definitely getting on up there in years. The actual dark sequence is handled very well, and because they're actually transferring and working from the film element, it's really nice in that sequence, because you get the sense of movement and something visibly there, even though it's pitch black, because we're actually looking at the film source itself. So apparently what they seem to have done is literally just had black leader for that sequence. So you still get the sense of the film moving through the gate, and if you were in a theater and seeing it projected, there would still be some sense of something there, as if you were in a room that was pitch black and you knew that there was someone there in the shadows who had nothing on their mind but your death. So and then that adds to the palpable sense of tension with the design of the soundtrack being very intricate and all the sounds being amplified and directional. So actually having that replicated here and not just having, a static black image as some people might do if they were transferring this film, that's very important, very critical to preserve that. And I can't imagine what this was like in the 60s, seeing this in a theater. I would love to see this film in a theater, if only to experience that sequence in a dark, pitch black theater. This is definitely one of those films that you show people, and if they've never seen it before, you're kind of waiting for the ending and just waiting to see them just on the edge of their seats and how they experience that for the first time. But I think the transfer is really well done, and of course far better than the old DVD. The only thing I did notice, there was a tiny amount of frame movement and one or two spots, very, very minor. And most of that was really just in the opening titles, which also had a slightly softer look to them, and also a little bit of some more like noisy and blocky grain. But because that's the titles, and those are of course done optically, you do always have to expect some generational loss for the title sequence. So it's fitting that it looks a little bit softer and a little bit like it's from another source, because all title sequences were of course optically done and a generation away at least. So the opening titles do look a bit softer and obviously look a little bit different from the rest of the feature, but overall it's a beautiful, lovely looking scan that is miles better than the old DVD. The original mono mix is here in lossless DTS HDMA mono and sounds excellent. I've only had the DVD to compare with. That's the only version I've owned. I've never gotten the Laserdisc, and I would like to sometime, just to see what the transfer was like and also look at the mono mix on there. So I'm not sure if this is any different to the Laserdisc mono, but I've just never owned a copy to actually check for myself. But it sounds great for what it is and for a 1967 mono track with the limitations of that time. But it sounds healthy here in a lossless codec, and obviously the DVD was lossy, so it's another improvement for the audio over the DVD. To look at the packaging, we have the traditional Warner Archive usage of beautiful original artwork, nicely printed on a standard release for Blu-ray. Have the traditional Warner Archive spine with the black spine, and then the poster artwork is used for the disc label. And then we have a nicely stylized rear that it's not something that Warner Archive always does, so this is a nice touch. And then to talk about the extras, this does retain all of the DVD extras, as Warner Archive always does. When there's DVD extras, they always try to port them over, but unfortunately they usually don't have the budget to make new extras, so there's nothing new here. But this is also a little bit more substantial than your typical Warner DVD extras package, so it's good that these are here, because it's a little bit more than your usual Warner Extra, which might just be the trailer and like maybe a short 5 to 10 minute featurette that was made for the DVD. Here it's a little bit longer, because we get the Warner featurette that's entitled Take a Look in the Dark, and it's basically Alan Arkin and also Mel Ferrer, who was Hepburn's husband and produced the film. They talk about the making and development of the film and its shooting and release and reception, and it runs a little bit longer than your typical Warner featurette from the DVD era, so it's nice to look at that after the film and hear their reminiscing, and also quite poignant now, since unfortunately Alan Arkin recently passed away, and this is just one of his incredible performances. Especially more amazing that it was so early in his screen career, but this is an incredible film to revisit, particularly for his performance. Then we also get two trailers. We get the rather interesting and amusing warning preview trailer or a teaser trailer, and then we get the film's original trailer. The theatrical trailer is in HD, it is a nice scan, and then the preview or teaser trailers is standard def. Both of them look quite nice, and they do give you an idea of what seeing a print might have looked like, because the color time is a little different. And then they also, of course, hype up the ending dark climax sequence. So it's nicely done in the trailer, and the trailers are cut quite well for a 60s film. And it gives you a slight idea of maybe what this would have played like in terms of a theatrical engagement in 1967. So that is the Warner Archive release of Wait Until Dark on Blu-ray, one of I think their most essential Blu-rays that they have put together. It's a beautiful, lovely master, a huge, enormous upgrade over the previous Warner DVD, and again, just an absolute delight to return to in terms of being one of the all-time great suspense thrillers and one of the extremely rare films that truly deserves the Hitchcockian label in every sense of the word. It is also the natural successor to Dial M for Murder because, of course, it's based on the Frederick Knott stage play. So this is an essential film. This is a film that everyone should see. You could watch it even for an October viewing for Halloween season. It is one of the cinema's great suspense thrillers, very much continuing in the sort of tradition of, say, Sorry, Wrong Number, but building to practically unbearable levels of suspense, and yet another example of why Terence Young was a completely unheralded, unbelievably brilliant director. And again, if I had to choose my favorite Audrey Hepburn performance in any film, it is this in Wait Until Dark. So as always, I hope my babblings about films, physical media releases, and the Warner Archive have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.
Ow! I knew this in the dark gag was a bad idea.